The vision lasted only a heartbeat before darkness reclaimed her world, but Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She'd seen something impossible, not through her damaged eyes, but through something deeper, more primal. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. "I'm sorry," she whispered, starting to rise. "I must have taken the wrong seat. Stay." The command was soft but carried an authority that made her pause. "The storm will pass soon enough." Around them, the ballroom buzzed with nervous chatter and the shuffle of feet as guests fumbled for their phones' flashlights. The academy staff called out reassurances about backup generators, but their voices seemed distant, muffled. All of Lyra's attention focused on the man beside her, the heat radiating from his skin, the controlled rhythm of his breathing, and that wild scent that reminded her of moonlit forests. "You're not afraid?" he observed, and she detected genuine curiosity beneath the roughness. "Should I be?" Lyra tilted her head toward his voice. In the darkness, she felt more like herself. No one could see her clouded eyes or the slight hesitation in her movements. Here, she had the advantage. "I've been blind for 15 years. This is just Tuesday night for me." A low sound escaped him, almost like a chuckle, but deeper. Most people stumble in the dark. Most people rely too heavily on their eyes. She smoothed her black evening dress, a simple design her roommate had chosen. They forget they have other senses. And what do your other senses tell you about me? The question was loaded with something she couldn't identify. Lyra turned toward him fully, her trained musician's ear catching the subtle tension in his voice. "You're not comfortable in crowds. Your breathing suggests you're holding something back. And you smell like you spend more time outdoors than in boardrooms, despite the expensive cologne you're wearing over it." Silence stretched between them, filled only by distant thunder, and the rustle of fabric as other guests moved about the darkened room. Lyra wondered if she'd overstepped. Reading people was a survival skill she'd developed, but not everyone appreciated being analyzed. "Perceptive," he said finally. "What's your name?" "Lyra Chen. I'm here because my instructor thinks classical pianists need to schmooze with potential patrons." She paused. "Though I suspect I'm at the wrong table entirely. Kieran." He didn't offer a last name. "And you're at table 12. "I was assigned to table 7. She laughed softly. "I must have miscounted in the dark. Story of my life, always ending up where I don't belong. Maybe you're exactly where you're supposed to be." Something in his tone made her pulse quicken. Before she could analyze why, a new voice cut through the darkness. "Mr. Blackwood?" "Sir, we've been looking for you everywhere." The voice was crisp, professional, clearly staff. "The mayor wants to discuss the conservation project, and Mrs. Whitman insists on introducing you to her daughter." Lyra felt the man beside her, Kieran, stiffen. "Tell them I'm indisposed." "But sir—" "Handle it, Marcus." The authority in his voice was unmistakable now. This wasn't just any guest. He was someone important enough to have staff tracking his movements. Footsteps retreated, and Lyra processed what she'd learned. Blackwood. The name meant something, though she couldn't place it. Conservation projects suggested environmental work, and the deference in the staff member's voice indicated serious wealth or influence. "You're hiding," she said. It wasn't a question. Another stretch of silence. "From what?" "Responsibilities. People who want things from you. Maybe from yourself." She traced the edge of her water glass with one finger. "I recognize the signs because I do it too. What could you possibly be hiding from?" The question struck deeper than he probably intended. Lyra thought of the strange dreams that had plagued her since childhood, visions of silver light and ancient voices calling her name, of the way electronics sometimes malfunctioned around her when she was emotional, of the peculiar fact that animals, especially dogs, either feared her or treated her with an almost human-like reverence. "Expectations," she said instead. "People see the blind girl and either want to help too much or assume I can't do anything for myself. They never just see me." Lightning flickered again, briefer this time, and Lyra caught another impossible glimpse. Broad shoulders, sharp cheekbones, and those same golden eyes that seemed to see straight through her. But more than that, she sensed something wild and restless beneath his human facade, like a wolf pacing behind bars. The lights suddenly blazed back to life, and Lyra blinked in the familiar gray haze that had been her vision since the accident. Around them, guests applauded and resumed their conversations, the spell of darkness broken. But the connection between them remained, electric and unexplained. "I should find my actual table," Lyra said, though she made no move to leave. "Should." Kieran's voice was quieter now, almost reluctant. "But the question is, do you want to?" The question hung between them like a challenge, and Lyra found herself frozen in the crystalline light of the restored chandeliers. Around their table, she could hear the rustle of evening gowns and the clink of champagne glasses as the gala resumed its careful choreography of wealth and charity. But here, in this pocket of tension, time seemed suspended. Lyra began, then stopped herself. The honest answer was no, she didn't want to leave. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt genuinely intrigued by another person. But admitting that felt dangerous in ways she couldn't articulate. "Lyra!" A familiar voice cut through her internal debate. Sarah's heels clicked rapidly across the marble floor, accompanied by the rustle of what Lyra knew would be her roommate's burgundy cocktail dress. The one Sarah claimed made her look sophisticated, instead of like a graduate student surviving on ramen and library coffee. "There you are. I've been searching everywhere." Sarah's breathing was slightly labored, suggesting she'd been genuinely worried. "When the lights went out, I couldn't find you at our table, and with all these people—" She stopped mid-sentence, and Lyra could practically feel her roommate's gaze shifting to Kieran. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were with someone." Lyra felt the familiar tug of her ordinary world reasserting itself. Sarah, her anchor to normalcy, her translator for the visual world of social cues and unspoken rules. The reminder that in 20 minutes, they'd drive back to their cramped apartment near the university, where Lyra's life waited in all its careful, controlled predictability. Sarah Martinez, her roommate, introduced herself, and Lyra heard the subtle shift in her voice that meant she was impressed by something, probably Kieran's appearance or the expensive cut of his suit. Kieran Blackwood. He stood as he spoke, and Lyra caught the whisper of fabric, the subtle displacement of air that suggested considerable height and presence. "I was just keeping Lyra company during the blackout." "Blackwood," Sarah repeated, and Lyra could practically hear the gears turning in her roommate's head. Sarah had grown up in San Francisco society before her family's financial reversal. She knew names, bloodlines, the intricate web of Northern California wealth. As in Blackwood Environmental, the Land Conservation Foundation, among other things. His tone suggested polite disinterest in discussing his business ventures. Lyra filed away this information, adding it to the growing puzzle of the man beside her. Environmental conservation, serious money, the kind of life that operated in spheres far removed from her world of practice rooms and part-time teaching gigs. "I teach children's piano lessons," she found herself saying, though neither of them had asked. The words spilled out like a confession, a reality check. "On Tuesday afternoons. Mrs. Kim's 7-year-old daughter is learning for Elise, and she gets the fingering wrong on the same measure every single week." It was such a mundane detail, so utterly ordinary compared to conservation foundations and charity galas. But it was real, it was hers, and it felt important to claim that space. "Do you enjoy it?" Kieran's question surprised her with its genuine interest. Yes, actually." Lyra considered this. "There's something pure about teaching music to children. They don't see limitations, only possibilities. Little Minjun thinks I'm magical because I can play with my eyes closed. Maybe you are." The words were spoken quietly, but they carried a weight that made Lyra's breath catch. Sarah cleared her throat delicately, a sound Lyra recognized as her roommate's polite signal that social protocols were being stretched. "We should probably find our actual table," Sarah said gently. "The program starts in 15 minutes, and Professor Williams wanted to introduce Lyra to some potential patrons." Professor Williams, her classical piano instructor, who'd spent months convincing her to attend this gala, the man who believed her talent could open doors to performance opportunities, maybe even a recording contract, if she impressed the right people, the future he envisioned for her, concert halls and recitals, a life lived in the spotlight of her musical abilities. It was a good future, a safe future, one where her blindness became part of her story as a performer rather than a limitation to overcome. So why did the thought of returning to it suddenly feel like putting on clothes that no longer fit quite right? Of course. Lyra stood, smoothing her dress, and reaching for her white cane where it rested against the table. "Thank you for keeping me company during the storm." Kieran moved as if to help her, then stopped himself, a courtesy she appreciated. Too many people assumed she needed assistance with basic movements. "Lyra." Her name and his voice sounded different somehow, like he was tasting each syllable. "What if I told you that some storms aren't meant to be weathered alone?" She paused, her fingers tightening on her cane's handle. Around them, the gala continued its elegant dance of money and influence, but she felt suspended between two worlds, the one she knew, and something else entirely. "I'd say that depends on what comes after the storm," she replied softly. "Mr. Blackwood." The voice that interrupted was crisp, authoritative, and completely unfamiliar. Lyra heard the sharp click of expensive heels approaching their small circle, each step deliberate and commanding. "How unexpected to find you here." The temperature around their group seemed to drop several degrees. Lyra felt Kieran's entire body tense beside her, his breathing shifting to something more controlled, more guarded. Even Sarah stepped closer, an unconscious protective movement that Lyra's heightened senses picked up immediately. "Vivienne." Kieran's voice had transformed completely. Gone was the warm, slightly rough tone he'd used with Lyra, replaced by something cold and carefully neutral. "I wasn't aware you'd be attending tonight." "Oh, I make it my business to know where certain people spend their evenings." The woman's voice carried a cultured accent, possibly European, with an undercurrent of something that made Lyra's skin prickle. Especially when they've been so elusive lately. Lyra tilted her head, her musician's ear catching nuances others might miss. There was familiarity between these two, but not the comfortable kind. This was the familiarity of shared history, of unresolved tensions. The woman's perfume was expensive and overwhelming, something with notes of jasmine and something else Lyra couldn't identify, something that reminded her oddly of metal and moonlight. "Ladies," Kieran said, and Lyra could hear him forcing civility into his tone. "This is Vivienne Moreau. Vivienne, Lyra Chen, and Sarah Martinez." Charmed. Vivienne's attention swept over them dismissively before returning to Kieran. "We need to discuss the Northern Territory situation. There have been developments. Northern Territories." Lyra filed away another piece of the puzzle that was Kieran Blackwood, but something about the phrase made her inexplicably uneasy. There was weight behind those words, implications that went beyond simple business ventures. "This isn't the time or place," Kieran replied firmly. "On the contrary, I think it's the perfect time." Vivienne's voice carried a subtle threat, especially considering your recent absences from important meetings. "The council is growing impatient." Lyra felt Sarah shift uncomfortably beside her. Her roommate was clearly picking up on the tension, though probably not understanding its source. But Lyra sensed something deeper, an undercurrent of danger that made every instinct she'd developed over 15 years of navigating the world through sound and intuition scream that something was wrong. "Perhaps we should go," Sarah murmured, her voice tight with social anxiety. But before anyone could move, the lights flickered again, just once, but enough to send a ripple of nervous laughter through the nearby guests. In that brief moment of dimness, Lyra felt something shift in the air around them, something electric and wild that seemed to emanate from Kieran himself. When the lights steadied, Vivienne was smiling, but there was nothing pleasant about it. "How interesting. Your control seems to be slipping, Kieran. Perhaps it's time to return where you belong, before someone gets hurt." The threat in her words was unmistakable now, even to Sarah, who took another step closer to Lyra. But what truly unsettled Lyra was Kieran's reaction, or rather his forced lack of reaction. She could hear his heartbeat accelerating, could sense the tension radiating from his body like heat from a forge. "My personal life is not your concern," he said quietly. But there was something dangerous in his tone that made Lyra think of storm clouds building on the horizon. Everything about you is our concern, Vivian replied smoothly, especially when you start forming inappropriate attachments. Her gaze, Lyra could feel it like a physical touch, swept over her appraisingly. To humans who don't understand the consequences of getting involved in our world. Our world. The phrase hit Lyra like a physical blow, though she couldn't explain why. There was something about the way Vivian said it, something that spoke of hidden knowledge, of secrets that existed parallel to the ordinary world Lyra had always known. That's enough. Kieran's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried such authority that several nearby conversations actually paused. We're done here. Are we? Vivian's laugh was like silver bells dipped in poison. I don't think you understand the position you're in, Kieran, or the position you're putting others in. Her attention fixed on Lyra again. Some gifts are too dangerous to ignore, and some bloodlines too important to leave unprotected. The words sent ice through Lyra's veins. Bloodlines, gifts. This woman knew something about her, something that Lyra herself didn't understand. The dreams, the strange moments when electronics failed around her, the way she'd somehow seen during the blackout. Suddenly, it all felt connected, part of a larger picture that terrified her. Lyra, Sarah whispered urgently. We should really go. Professor Williams. But Lyra found herself frozen, caught between the safety of her ordinary life and the terrible certainty that it was already too late. Whatever Vivian's arrival meant, whatever world she represented, Lyra was already part of it. The choice she faced was becoming clear. Run back to the safety of her controlled existence, or step forward into something that would change everything forever. The words bloodlines and gifts echoed in Lyra's mind, like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of fear through her carefully constructed reality. She gripped her cane tighter, her knuckles white against the smooth handle, as every instinct screamed at her to run. But her feet remained rooted to the marble floor, trapped between Sarah's familiar presence and the gravitational pull of whatever dark knowledge Vivian Moreau possessed, the rational part of her mind, the part that had rebuilt her life after losing her sight, that scheduled her days in careful increments and found safety in routine, demanded she walk away. Return to Table 7, sit through the charity presentations, go home to her apartment where the biggest mystery was whether her upstairs neighbor would practice violin at midnight again. Lyra. Sarah's whisper carried genuine worry now. We really should. No. The word escaped before Lyra could stop it. She felt Sarah's sharp intake of breath, heard Kieran shift almost imperceptibly closer, as if positioning himself between her and some unseen threat. I need to know what she means. The confession terrified her even as she spoke it. For 15 years, she'd trained herself not to ask questions about the strange occurrences that seemed to follow her like shadows. The dreams of silver light and ancient voices. The way electronics malfunctioned around her during emotional stress. The inexplicable moment during the blackout when she'd seen Kieran's face, seen the golden fire in his eyes that should have been impossible. She'd buried those anomalies beneath layers of practical adaptation, told herself they were trauma responses, tricks of memory, anything but what they actually felt like, glimpses of something larger, something that existed just beyond the edges of her understanding. Some knowledge comes with a price, dear, Vivian said, her voice silk wrapped around steel. Are you prepared to pay it? Lyra felt Kieran's tension spike, heard the barely audible rumble in his chest that sounded almost like a growl. The sound should have been alarming, but instead it sparked something deep in her consciousness, something that whispered recognition even as her logical mind rejected the impossibility. Don't. Kieran's voice was strained. And when Lyra turned toward him, she caught the faintest trace of something wild in his scent, pine forests and night air, something that spoke of spaces far from civilization. Lyra, whatever she's implying, you don't want any part of it. But that was exactly the problem. Some treacherous part of her did want it. Had always wanted it, had spent years feeling like she was living someone else's smaller life while her real existence waited somewhere just out of reach. My mother died in the same accident that took my sight, Lyra said suddenly, the words tumbling out despite Sarah's sharp intake of breath beside her. She never talked about that night, had learned that people became uncomfortable with grief that couldn't be neatly categorized and moved past. But sometimes I dream about her, and she's telling me things I don't understand. About being careful, about hiding. What did she need to hide from? The silence that followed felt heavy with significance. Lyra could practically taste the exchange of looks between Kieran and Vivian, could feel Sarah's growing alarm as the conversation veered into territory her roommate couldn't begin to comprehend. "Interesting," Vivian murmured. "She didn't tell you anything before she died? No stories about your grandmother, perhaps? No family legends that seemed too strange to be real?" Each question hit like a small shock. Lyra's grandmother, who had insisted on teaching her Mandarin even though they lived in California, who had filled her early childhood with stories of women who could see the future, who spoke of moon-blessed bloodlines as if they were historical fact rather than folklore. Stories her mother had abruptly stopped when Lyra started school, claiming they were just old superstitions that would confuse her American-born daughter. "You know something about my family," Lyra said, her voice barely steady. "About me. I know that some accidents aren't accidents at all," Vivian replied cryptically. "And that 15 years is a long time to keep certain abilities suppressed, but not forever." The fear that had been building in Lyra's chest crystallized into something approaching panic. Her life, her careful, controlled, predictable life, suddenly felt like tissue paper in a windstorm. Piano lessons and practice schedules, her teaching job, her modest dreams of concert performances, all of it threatened to dissolve, under the weight of questions she'd spent half her lifetime refusing to ask. "I can't," she whispered, taking a half step backward. "I have students depending on me, commitments. A life that works. A life that's half-lived," Vivian said gently, and the unexpected kindness in her tone was somehow more terrifying than her earlier threats. "But the choice is yours, Lara Chen. For now." The implicit deadline in those last two words made Lyra's blood run cold. Whatever was happening, whatever she was apparently connected to, it wouldn't wait indefinitely for her to find courage she wasn't sure she possessed. For several heartbeats, Lyra stood suspended between two worlds, the one she'd carefully constructed from routine and predictability, and the one that beckoned from the shadows of Vivian's cryptic warnings. The gala continued around them, a glittering tableau of normalcy that suddenly felt as fragile as spun glass. How long? The question emerged from some deep, reckless part of herself she'd kept buried for 15 years. "How long do I have to decide?" Sarah's sharp intake of breath cut through the air like a blade. "Lyra, what are you talking about? Decide what?" But Lyra barely heard her roommate's confusion. Every fiber of her being was focused on Vivian's answer, on the terrible certainty that her safe, small world was already crumbling whether she chose to acknowledge it or not. "The convergence happens during the new moon," Vivian said, her voice carrying the weight of inevitability. 3 days. 3 days. The timeline hit Lyra like a physical blow. Tuesday's piano lessons with little Min Jun, who was finally getting the fingering right on Fur Elise. Wednesday's faculty meeting, where Professor Williams wanted to discuss her spring recital. Thursday's quiet evening planned with Sarah, grading papers and listening to old recordings. All of it suddenly felt like borrowed time. "Convergence of what?" Kieran demanded, and there was something in his tone that spoke of protective fury barely held in check. "What aren't you telling us?" Vivian's laugh was soft and dangerous. "Oh, but surely you can sense it, Kieran, the way reality bends around her, the way electronics fail when her emotions run high, the way you yourself responded to her presence." Her voice dropped to something almost intimate. "Tell me, Lyra, what did you see during the blackout, when you touched his hand?" The memory crashed over her with sudden, devastating clarity. Golden eyes in the darkness, the impossible moment when blindness had given way to sight that came from somewhere deeper than her damaged optic nerves. The certainty that she was seeing not just Kieran's face, but something essential about who he was beneath the carefully controlled exterior. "I saw him," she whispered, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff. "I shouldn't have been able to, but I saw—" "Don't." Kieran's voice was raw. "Lyra, please, you don't understand what you're getting into." But she was beginning to understand. And that was the most terrifying part. The dreams that had haunted her since childhood weren't trauma responses or her mind playing tricks. Her grandmother's stories weren't folklore. The accident that had claimed her mother and her sight hadn't been random tragedy. Everything she'd thought she knew about herself was a lie, and the truth was standing before her in the form of a woman who spoke of convergences and bloodlines as casually as discussing the weather. My mother knew, didn't she? Lyra's voice was steadier now, though her hands trembled against her cane. She knew what I was, what I could become. The accident. It wasn't really an accident. Sarah's confused protest faded into background noise, as Vivian's silence confirmed what Lyra had already known in her heart. Her mother hadn't died in a random collision on a rain-slicked road. She'd died protecting something. Protecting someone. Protecting Lyra. She made a choice, Vivian said finally. To give you a normal childhood, to suppress your gifts until you were old enough to understand them. But suppression only works for so long, and there are others who've been watching, waiting for your abilities to manifest. Others? The word tasted like metal and fear. Our world has been out of balance for too long, Vivian continued, ignoring Kieran's warning growl. The old bloodlines scattered, the traditional alliances broken. But you could change that. Your gift could bridge worlds that have been separate for centuries. Lyra thought of her careful life, her scheduled lessons and predictable routines, the safety she'd built from structure and familiar patterns. In 3 days it could all be stripped away, leaving her exposed to forces she didn't understand in a world she'd never known existed. The smart choice was obvious. Walk away. Let Sarah lead her back to their table, sit through the charity presentations, return to her apartment and her ordinary concerns. Pretend this conversation had never happened. But as she stood there, feeling the weight of destiny pressing down on her shoulders, Lyra realized the choice had already been made. Not by her, but for her, 15 years ago on a rain-soaked road where her mother had died keeping secrets that were now demanding to be told. If I don't choose, she said quietly, what happens to the people around me? To Sarah? To my students? The question hung in the air like a blade, and Vivian's small smile was answer enough. Lyra Chen, who had spent 15 years building a life from careful control and measured steps, took a breath that tasted of pine forests and moonlight, and made the choice that would unmake everything she'd ever known. Tell me what I need to know. The words hung in the air between them, irrevocable as a bell's toll. Lyra felt Sarah's hand clamp down on her arm, her roommate's grip tight with fear and confusion, but there was no taking it back now. She had stepped across a threshold she hadn't even known existed, and already the world felt different around her, sharper, more electric, humming with possibilities that both terrified and exhilarated her. Finally, Vivian breathed, and there was genuine satisfaction in her voice. Very well, but not here. Her gaze swept the glittering gala with obvious distaste. Too many ears, too many eyes that don't need to see what comes next. I'm not going anywhere with you, Kieran said flatly, positioning himself more squarely between Lyra and Vivian. The protective gesture sent an unexpected warmth through Lyra's chest, though she couldn't quite explain why his concern felt so natural, so right. Actually, a new voice interrupted, smooth and cultured, with the faintest hint of an accent Lyra couldn't place. I think neutral ground would be best. Lyra turned toward the voice, her enhanced senses immediately cataloging details. Expensive shoes on marble, Italian leather, custom made, cologne that spoke of old money and older secrets. But underneath it all, something else, something that made the air around him feel charged with the same electric potential she'd begun to associate with whatever supernatural world she was apparently part of. Professor Thorne, Vivian said, and for the first time since she'd appeared, her voice carried a note of genuine respect. I didn't know you were attending tonight. I make it a point to keep track of interesting developments, the newcomer replied mildly. And this young woman's presence here tonight is very interesting indeed. He moved closer, and Lyra caught the whisper of fabric that suggested formal academic robes over traditional evening wear. Miss Chen, I presume? I'm Alexander Thorne. I teach certain specialized subjects at a private institution that might be relevant to your current situation. How does everyone seem to know more about my life than I do? Lyra asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. The number of people who apparently had knowledge about her mysterious heritage was growing by the minute, and each new revelation made her feel more like a chess piece than a person making her own choices. Because you've been carefully protected, Professor Thorne said gently. Your mother was quite thorough in her efforts to keep you hidden, but protection can only last so long when the gifts involved are as powerful as yours appear to be. Sarah's grip on Lyra's arm tightened to the point of pain. Lyra, I don't understand any of this. What gifts? What is everyone talking about? The question hung heavy with years of friendship, with shared midnight conversations, and mutual support through all of life's smaller crises. Sarah had been her anchor to normalcy, her connection to a world where the strangest thing was a difficult student or an unreliable subway schedule. How could she possibly explain that everything they'd shared was built on a foundation of secrets Lyra herself was only beginning to understand? I can't, Lyra started, then stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what accepting this new reality would mean, not just for her, but for everyone she cared about. The human world and ours have been separate for good reason, Kieran said quietly, and there was pain in his voice that spoke of personal experience with the costs of bridging that divide. Some knowledge is dangerous, even to those we want to protect. But ignorance can be more dangerous still, Professor Thorne countered, especially when the convergence brings opportunities for those who would exploit untrained gifts. His attention fixed on Lyra with intensity she could feel like heat against her skin. There are others looking for you, Miss Chen. Others who view your awakening abilities as a tool to be claimed rather than a person to be protected. The words sent ice through her veins. What kind of others? The kind that your mother died keeping you hidden from, Vivian said bluntly. The kind that won't give you 3 days to decide, or care about your human attachments when they find you. Lyra felt the walls of her safe, predictable world crumbling completely now. Not just changed or challenged, but actively threatened by forces she couldn't even properly comprehend yet. The piano lessons and faculty meetings suddenly seemed not just distant, but impossibly naive, relics of a person she'd been before learning that monsters and magic were real. My apartment, she heard herself say, surprising everyone including herself. If we're going to do this, if I'm going to learn whatever it is I need to know, then we do it somewhere I feel safe. She straightened, drawing on reserves of strength she'd built through years of navigating a world designed for people who could see. And Sarah comes with me. Lyra, Kieran started, concern thick in his voice. Non-negotiable, she cut him off firmly. If I'm about to learn that everything I thought I knew was wrong, then I need someone with me who represents what's real, what's worth protecting. The silence that followed her declaration stretched taut as a violin string. Lyra could feel the weight of their collective judgment, their calculations of risk and necessity, and beneath it all, her own terror at what she'd just committed herself to. Absolutely not, Vivian said sharply. Bringing an untrained human into what? Sarah's voice cracked with strain. Lyra, I've been patient, but I need to understand what's happening here. These people are talking about you like you're some kind of something she's not ready to know about, Kieran finished quietly, and Lyra heard genuine anguish in his tone. Sarah, some truths can't be unknown. Some doors can't be closed once they're opened. But Professor Thorne's measured voice cut through their protests. The young woman may have a point. If Miss Chen is going to be thrust into our world regardless, having an anchor to her human life might provide valuable stability. He paused, and Lyra sensed him studying her with uncomfortable intensity. Besides, her friend has already seen too much tonight to be safely left ignorant. The implication hit Lyra like a physical blow. Sarah was in danger simply by association, by being present when Lyra's carefully constructed normal life had begun to unravel. The protection her mother had died to provide was extending beyond Lyra herself, drawing in everyone she cared about. This is insane, Sarah whispered, but her grip on Lyra's arm remained steady. "But whatever's happening, I'm not leaving you to face it alone." The fierce loyalty in her roommate's voice nearly broke Lyra's composure entirely. Sarah, who worried about mundane things like grocery budgets and subway delays, was offering to step into a supernatural world she couldn't begin to comprehend, rather than abandon their friendship. It was exactly the kind of fierce protectiveness that had made her the sister Lyra had never had, and exactly why Lyra needed her present for whatever came next. 1 hour, Vivian said finally, her tone suggesting significant reluctance. "We'll come to your apartment, share what you need to know immediately, and then proper arrangements must be made for your training." "Training for what?" Lyra demanded, but even as she asked, part of her already knew. The dreams of silver light and ancient voices, the strange moments when electronics failed around her during emotional stress, the impossible vision of Kieran's face during the blackout. These weren't random anomalies, but symptoms of something larger awakening within her. "For survival," Professor Thorne said bluntly. "The convergence isn't just about your abilities manifesting, Miss Chen. It's about the barriers between worlds thinning, about old enemies and older powers taking notice of what you represent. Your mother kept you hidden in plain sight for 15 years, but that protection died with her. Now you need to learn to protect yourself." The words settled over her like a shroud. Her apartment, her sanctuary of familiar sounds and carefully memorized layouts, was about to be invaded by people who spoke casually of supernatural enemies and otherworldly threats. The piano that had been her solace, the kitchen where she and Sarah shared morning coffee and evening wine, the couch where they graded papers and complained about difficult students, all of it would be forever changed by whatever revelations awaited. But there was no other choice. Not really. The danger was coming whether she acknowledged it or not, and at least this way she might have some measure of control over how her life unraveled. "The address is—" she began. "We'll follow you," Kieran interrupted gently. "Give you a few minutes to prepare whatever you need to." She almost laughed at that. How did one prepare for the complete reconstruction of reality? What did one pack for a journey into a world that shouldn't exist? "Come on," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying the forced calm she used with particularly difficult students. "Let's go home." Home. The word felt both precious and already lost. In 1 hour, her apartment would fill with people who spoke of convergences and bloodlines, who knew secrets about her family that had died with her mother. Whatever sanctuary she'd built from routine and careful independence was about to be shattered as completely as her sight had been 15 years ago. But as they moved toward the exit, Lyra felt Kieran fall into step beside them, his presence solid and unexpectedly comforting in the midst of her mounting panic. Whatever supernatural world she was about to enter, whatever powers were apparently awakening within her, she wouldn't face them entirely alone. The thought should have been more reassuring than it was, because, as they walked through the hotel's elegant lobby toward an uncertain future, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that she was leading not just herself, but everyone she cared about directly into the kind of danger her mother had died trying to prevent. The convergence was coming, ready or not, and Lyra Chen, who had spent 15 years building strength from structure and safety from routine, was about to discover whether that strength would be enough to protect the people who mattered most when her world finally collapsed completely. The ride back to her apartment passed in suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic click of Sarah's turn signal and the distant rumble of San Francisco traffic. Lyra pressed her face against the cool passenger window, her enhanced senses picking up details that should have been impossible. The metallic taste of fear in the air, the electric charge that seemed to follow them like a storm front, the way even familiar street sounds felt different now, as if the city itself had shifted into a minor key. "Your hands are shaking," Sarah observed quietly as they pulled into their building's parking garage. Lyra looked down at her trembling fingers, still wrapped around her white cane with white-knuckled intensity. "Everything's shaking," she replied, and it was true. Her carefully constructed world was coming apart at the seams, and she could feel the tremors in everything around her. The car's engine, the building's concrete structure, even her own heartbeat seemed unstable. They climbed the 3 flights to their apartment in silence, Sarah's keys jingling with unusual loudness in the stairwell. When the door swung open, Lyra was hit by a wave of sensory nostalgia so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes. The lingering scent of this morning's coffee, the soft tick of the antique clock Sarah had inherited from her grandmother, the whisper of air through the slightly warped window in the living room. All of it suddenly precious and fragile, like a photograph about to be burned. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked, hanging her coat on the hook by the door, with movements that suggested barely controlled panic. "Maybe 20 minutes. Lyra moved through the apartment with the fluid confidence of someone who had memorized every piece of furniture, every potential obstacle. But tonight, even familiar territory felt treacherous. The piano bench she'd navigated around thousands of times seemed positioned wrong. The coffee table appeared to have shifted inches from its usual spot. Even her own home was becoming foreign territory. She settled at the piano bench out of habit, her fingers finding the keys automatically. The opening notes of Chopin's Prelude in E minor filled the apartment, soft, melancholy, achingly beautiful. Music had always been her refuge when words weren't enough, when the world demanded more than she knew how to give. "Lyra." Sarah's voice was careful, measured. "I need you to tell me what's really happening here. Not the supernatural mystery novel version that woman was spouting. The truth. What aren't you telling me?" The music faltered under her fingers. How could she explain dreams that felt more real than waking life? The way electronics had been failing around her with increasing frequency. The impossible moment during the blackout when she'd seen Kieran's face, not with her damaged eyes, but with something deeper. More essential? "I don't know," she admitted, her hands stilling on the keys. "I mean, I'm starting to suspect, but Sarah, what if everything I tell you changes how you see me? What if I'm not who you thought I was?" "You're Lyra Chen," Sarah said, fiercely, moving to sit beside her on the bench. "You're the woman who taught me that strength doesn't always announce itself with noise. You're the best piano teacher at the conservatory and the worst cook in California. You cry at Disney movies and you've read more books than anyone has a right to. You're my best friend, and whatever else you might be doesn't change any of that." The fierce loyalty in Sarah's voice nearly shattered Lyra's composure entirely. Because in less than 15 minutes, people would arrive who spoke of convergences and ancient bloodlines, who knew secrets about her family that had died with her mother, and after tonight nothing would ever be simple again. A sharp knock echoed through the apartment, precise and somehow final. "They're here," Lyra whispered, her hands falling away from the piano keys with a discordant clatter. "Then we face this together," Sarah replied, squeezing her shoulder before moving toward the door. Lyra heard the locks turning, first the deadbolt, then the chain, then the doorknob with its familiar squeak. The apartment filled with presence immediately, Vivian's sharp perfume and sharper energy, Professor Thorne's academic gravitas and underlying power, and Kieran, whose very existence in her space felt like a fundamental shift in reality. "Miss Chen," Professor Thorne said formally as they arranged themselves in her living room, "are you prepared to learn who you really are?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Lyra thought of her mother, who had died keeping secrets that were now demanding to be told. She thought of her students, her carefully planned lessons, her quiet life built from routine and measured steps. She thought of Sarah beside her, loyal and terrified, and refusing to abandon ship even as it went down. Most of all, she thought of the growing certainty that preparation was irrelevant. The convergence was coming whether she was ready or not, bringing with it enemies and allies she couldn't yet distinguish, powers she didn't understand, and a destiny her mother had died trying to prevent. "No," Lyra said quietly, straightening her shoulders. "But tell me anyway." Professor Thorne's presence seemed to fill the small living room as he settled into Sarah's reading chair. "Your mother was Elena Blackthorne, not Chen, as you've always believed. She was the last true moonseer, born to a bloodline that could glimpse the threads connecting all supernatural realms." Lyra's world tilted. Even her name had been a lie. "Moonseers were oracles," Vivian continued, her voice unusually gentle. "They could see the future, read the supernatural bonds between souls, predict convergences decades in advance. Your mother foresaw something catastrophic, a war between the werewolf territories that would spill into the human world. She saw her own death, too, Kieran added quietly. And yours, if you remained in our world. The piano bench creaked as Lyra gripped it for stability. So she ran. She sacrificed everything, Professor Thorne corrected. Her position, her power, her connection to magic itself. The accident that took your sight. It wasn't random, Miss Chen. Your mother performed a binding ritual, using the trauma to seal away your abilities until you were old enough to survive them. Sarah's sharp intake of breath cut through the revelation. You're saying Lyra's blindness was intentional? It was protection, Vivian said firmly. Without it, she would have been consumed by visions before her 10th birthday. Moonseer children who manifest early rarely survive the intensity. Lyra felt something cracking inside her chest. 15 years of believing herself damaged, broken, less than whole, and it had all been her mother's desperate attempt to keep her alive. But the accident. My mother died in that accident. She died completing the ritual, Professor Thorne said with devastating gentleness. She gave her life to ensure the binding would hold, until the convergence forced your abilities to surface naturally. The room spun around her. Every memory, every moment of grief and adaptation and hard-won independence, all of it built on a foundation of sacrifice she'd never known existed. Her mother hadn't died because of her, she'd died for her. The binding is breaking down, Vivian continued relentlessly. That's why you're experiencing visions, why electronics fail around you, why you could see through the soul bond with Kieran. Your true abilities are emerging whether we want them to or not. What abilities exactly? Lyra whispered, though part of her already knew the answer would destroy what remained of her normal life. Prophetic sight, soul reading, the power to see truth through any deception or glamour. Professor Thorne leaned forward, and most importantly, the ability to predict and potentially prevent the supernatural war your mother died trying to stop. Which is why others want to claim you, Kieran said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Marcus Volkov, the Alpha who's been consolidating power across the Western territories. He's learned about your heritage. He believes controlling a Moonseer would let him win any conflict before it begins. Sarah stood abruptly. This is insane. You're talking about Lyra like she's some kind of weapon. To them, she is, Vivian said bluntly. The words hit Lyra like physical blows. Not a person. Not even a person with unusual gifts. A weapon to be claimed, controlled, used. She thought of her students, their faces bright with musical discovery, of her quiet evenings grading papers and sharing wine with Sarah, of the small, peaceful life she'd built from the ashes of her childhood trauma. I won't do it, she said firmly. I won't be anyone's oracle or weapon or tool. I have a life here. You don't have a choice, Professor Thorne said with crushing finality. Volkov's people tracked the convergence to this area. They'll find you within days, perhaps hours. As if summoned by his words, a new sound cut through the night air, the low rumble of motorcycles approaching the building. Too many motorcycles, moving with military precision. Kieran was at the window instantly, his body going rigid. We're too late, they're here, Vivian cursed in what sounded like ancient Gaelic. Basement exit? Fire escape only, Sarah said, her voice high with panic. The building's main door exploded inward 3 floors below, the sound reverberating through the structure like thunder. Heavy footsteps echoed in the stairwell, multiple sets, moving fast and purposefully upward. The binding ritual, Professor Thorne said urgently to Kieran. If we could complete what her mother started, with what power? Vivian snapped. It would take 3 moonseers and a full lunar eclipse. The footsteps reached the 2nd floor. Lyra could hear them now, voices speaking in guttural tones that made her skin crawl. Whatever was coming for her wasn't entirely human. Lyra, Sarah whispered, grabbing her hand. We have to run. But there was nowhere to run. 3 floors up, 1 exit, and hostile forces controlling the only way out. Lyra's carefully protected life had become a trap, and everyone she cared about was caught inside it with her. The footsteps reached their floor. Her mother had died to give her 15 years of safety, and Lyra had just led everyone she loved directly into the supernatural war she was supposed to prevent. All was lost. The apartment door shuddered under heavy fists, the sound reverberating through Lyra's bones like a death knell. Sarah's hand tightened around hers, as Professor Thorne muttered something that sounded like a protection spell under his breath. But Lyra barely heard any of it, because suddenly, impossibly, she could see. Not with her damaged eyes, those remained as sightless as they'd been for 15 years, but with something deeper, more primal, as if her mother's dying ritual had finally cracked wide open. The apartment blazed with supernatural light that had nothing to do with electricity. Vivian's aura pulsed silver bright with barely contained power. Professor Thorne radiated the deep gold of ancient knowledge. Kieran burned like a beacon, his soul bond to her visible as threads of starlight connecting their hearts. And through the walls, she could see the creatures ascending the stairwell. They weren't human, not anymore. Volkov's enforcers had been twisted by dark magic, their souls stained crimson with violence and corrupted purpose. But beneath their monstrous transformation, she glimpsed something that made her blood freeze. They weren't here to capture her. "They're not coming to take me alive," she whispered, the vision hitting her like ice water. "Volkov, he's changed his mind. He's decided I'm too dangerous to control." Kieran spun from the window. "What?" The revelation crashed over her in waves of prophetic sight. She could see it all now. Volkov's original plan to claim her, his growing fear as reports reached him of her abilities manifesting ahead of schedule, his final decision to eliminate the threat she represented, rather than risk her power falling into enemy hands. "He wants me dead," she said, the words tasting like ash. Better a dead moon seer than one his enemies might claim. Another thunderous impact against the door. The frame was splintering. "The fire escape," Sarah started to say, but Lyra was already shaking her head. "There are 3 more of them on the roof," she said, her new sight piercing through floors and walls like they were glass, "and 2 in the alley below. We're surrounded." Professor Thorne's face went pale. "Lyra, you need to focus. Can you see a way out?" She tried, desperately reaching deeper into the visions flooding her mind. But all she could see were paths that led to death. Sarah falling as they tried to reach the fire escape, Professor Thorne's magic failing against superior numbers, Kieran's brave last stand buying them perhaps 30 seconds of borrowed time. "No," she gasped. "Every future I can see, we all die here." The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and twisted metal. Dark figures poured through the opening, their eyes glowing with predatory hunger. Sarah screamed. Vivian raised her hands, power crackling between her fingers. Kieran shifted partially, his human features taking on lupine edges as he prepared to fight. But Lyra's attention was caught by something else entirely, a flutter of movement in her peripheral vision that made no sense, because standing in her kitchen, translucent and shimmering with spectral light, was her mother. Elena Blackthorne looked exactly as she had 15 years ago, but her ghostly form radiated power that made the apartment's air thick and electric. Her mouth moved soundlessly, urgent words that Lyra couldn't quite hear over the chaos erupting around her. "Mom?" Lyra whispered. Elena pointed desperately toward the piano, her ethereal face twisted with urgency. The piano where Lyra had spent countless hours finding solace in music, where her fingers had traced the same keys her mother had once played during lullabies and lonely evenings. Understanding struck like lightning. The piano wasn't just furniture, it was a focal point. Her mother had chosen this apartment, this instrument, for a reason. 15 years of Lyra's music, 15 years of unconscious power channeled through ivory keys and steel strings, had been charging something hidden within. Lyra lunged toward the piano as the first enforcer reached Sarah. Her fingers crashed down on the keys in a chord that should have been impossible for human hands to span, a harmonic convergence that her mother had taught her in childhood, disguised as a simple exercise. The apartment exploded with silver light. Power erupted from the piano like a sonic boom, racing outward in concentric waves that sent the enforcers flying backward into the walls. But this wasn't destruction. It was revelation. The binding ritual her mother had died to create hadn't just sealed Lyra's abilities away. It had been storing them, concentrating 15 years of suppressed power into a single moment of desperate need. Lyra felt her mother's presence one last time, a whispered blessing that tasted like tears and starlight. "My daughter, my brave girl." You were never meant to hide forever. The ghostly figure faded, but the power remained, not wild and uncontrolled, but focused through years of musical discipline into something magnificent and terrible. Lyra rose from the piano bench, silver light cascading from her blind eyes like tears made of starfire. She could see everything now, not just the present moment, but the threads of possibility spreading out before them like a vast web. And for the first time since the convergence began, some of those threads led to survival. The broken little blind girl was gone. In her place stood Elena Blackthorne's true daughter, a moonseer in full command of her birthright. The real battle was just beginning. The enforcers lay crumpled against the walls like discarded dolls, their twisted forms unconscious, but still breathing. Lyra stood amid the wreckage of her former life, power humming through her veins like electricity through copper wire. The silver light emanating from her eyes had dimmed to a soft glow, but the apartment still thrummed with residual energy. "Holy shit," Sarah whispered, pushing herself up from behind the overturned coffee table where she'd taken shelter. "Lyra, your eyes, they're actually glowing." Lyra turned toward her best friend's voice, and for the first time since childhood, she could see Sarah's face clearly, not through her damaged retinas, but through the supernatural sight that had finally claimed its birthright. Sarah's aura blazed with loyalty and fierce protectiveness, tinged with understandable terror at the impossible scene unfolding around her. "Are you hurt?" Lyra asked, extending her enhanced senses to check for injuries among her allies. Professor Thorne was shaken but unharmed, his academic composure cracked but not shattered. Vivian bore a cut on her forehead from flying debris, but was already healing through her own magic. And Kieran was staring at her with an expression of awe and something deeper, more complex. Through their soul bond, she felt his amazement mixing with protective fury and a love so intense it nearly staggered her. "We need to move," he said, his tactical instincts overriding everything else. "These were just the advance scouts. Volkov will have more coming, and now that I've fully manifested, everything changes," Lyra interrupted, her voice carrying new authority. She could see it all now, the web of supernatural politics that had shaped her entire life, the approaching conflict that would determine the balance of power across all territories, and most importantly, the narrow paths that might lead to victory rather than annihilation. She moved to the window, her newfound sight piercing through the darkness to catalog threats and opportunities across the city below. "Vivian, how many safe houses does the council maintain in Northern California?" 3 within 50 miles, Vivian replied, wiping blood from her forehead. "But if Volkov found this place—" "He found this place because I was hiding," Lyra said, understanding crystallizing with painful clarity. "The binding ritual made me a beacon that grew brighter as it weakened. But now that it's broken completely, now that I have full control, I can shield us. Hide us in ways my mother never taught me because she never had the chance to learn them herself." Professor Thorne stepped forward, his scholarly excitement warring with concern. "Lyra, you've been fully manifested for less than 10 minutes. The power you're describing requires years of training." "I don't have years," she said simply. "None of us do. The convergence my mother foresaw, it's not some distant possibility anymore. Volkov's actions tonight have accelerated everything. The supernatural war starts now, whether we're ready or not." Through the soul bond, she felt Kieran's wolf responding to the authority in her voice, recognizing her not as someone to be protected, but as someone capable of leading. The realization sent a thrill through both of them. "What do you need from us?" he asked. Lyra closed her physical eyes, letting her supernatural sight range further. She could see the larger patterns now, Volkov's forces massing across 3 states, other alpha territories choosing sides or preparing to retreat, the human world blissfully unaware that their reality was about to be shattered by a conflict that had been building for decades. But she could also see something else, hidden allies who had been waiting for this moment, supernatural communities that had been driven underground by Volkov's expansion, young werewolves in his own territory who chafed under his increasingly tyrannical rule. "Sarah," she said, turning to her best friend, "I need you to contact Dr. Martinez at the conservatory. Tell him there's been a family emergency and you're both taking indefinite leave. Don't pack anything. We can't risk returning here. Lyra, I can't just abandon my life. Your life is standing right here, Lyra said gently but firmly. And if you stay in the ordinary world while I'm fighting this war, you'll become a target they can use against me. I won't let that happen. Sarah's face cycled through fear, protest, and finally resigned determination. Okay. But I want to understand what I'm getting into. Professor Thorne, I need you to send word to the council. Tell them the last Moonseer has manifested and is calling for a convergence assembly. Every supernatural faction that wants to survive what's coming needs to choose a side. Professor Thorne nodded grimly. And our immediate destination? Lyra's sight swept north, toward the misty mountains where this had all begun, where Kieran's own territory offered not just safety, but strategic advantages she was only beginning to understand. We're going home, she said, surprising herself with how right the words felt. To Kieran's packlands. It's time I met the people I'm fighting for. The broken girl who had stumbled into the wrong seat was gone. In her place stood a Moonseer ready to claim her destiny. The journey to Kieran's territory began in pre-dawn darkness, their convoy of 2 cars winding through mountain roads still slick with night mist. Lyra rode with Kieran in the lead vehicle, her supernatural sight monitoring their surroundings for threats while Sarah and Professor Thorne followed with Vivian providing magical protection. Tell me about your pack, Lyra said, watching the landscape transform through her enhanced vision. Even in darkness, she could see the subtle shift as they crossed from human-controlled territory into werewolf lands. The very air hummed differently here, wilder and more alive. Kieran's hands tightened on the steering wheel. They've been without their alpha king for too long. I've ruled from a distance, hiding among humans while sending orders through intermediaries. They know about the curse, but they've never seen me struggle with it firsthand. Through their soul bond, Lyra felt his deeper fear, not of rejection, but of being seen as the broken leader he believed himself to be. You're afraid they'll think you're weak. I am weak, he said quietly. Every full moon, every moment of strong emotion, I lose control. What kind of alpha king can't master his own wolf? Lyra reached across the center console to take his hand, and immediately her sight showed her the truth he couldn't see himself. Your curse isn't weakness, Kieran. It's proof of how deeply you feel everything, your responsibility, your love for your people, your fear of failing them. The forced transformations happen because your wolf knows you're trying to bear everything alone. That doesn't make me a better leader. It makes you a leader worth following, she said firmly. And now you won't be bearing everything alone. They crested a ridge just as dawn broke, revealing the hidden valley that served as the heart of Kieran's territory. Lyra's breath caught, where her supernatural sight had shown her the ethereal beauty of the landscape. The growing natural light revealed its physical magnificence. Ancient pine forests rising toward snow-capped peaks, a crystal-clear river winding through meadows that still held the last stubborn wildflowers of autumn. But it was the settlement in the valley's heart that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. This wasn't some primitive werewolf compound from human imagination. Instead, she saw a community that blended seamlessly with its natural surroundings. Buildings of stone and reclaimed wood that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. Gardens that merged cultivated spaces with wild growth. Children playing in courtyards while adults went about their morning routines with purposeful contentment. It's beautiful, she whispered. It's home, Kieran replied. And through their bond she felt his own wonder at seeing his territory through her eyes, not as a responsibility that weighed him down, but as something precious worth protecting. Their arrival sent ripples of awareness through the pack. Lyra could see the supernatural communication network that linked the werewolves, shared sense and subtle body language that conveyed complex information faster than words, news of their Alpha King's return, and of the mysterious woman beside him whose power made the very air shimmer, spread throughout the settlement in minutes. By the time they reached the main lodge, a crowd had gathered. Lyra stepped out of the car and immediately felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. Through her sight, she could see the mixture of emotions radiating from the assembled pack: curiosity, wariness, hope, and from some of the older wolves, recognition that sent chills down her spine. Some of them knew my mother, she murmured to Kieran. The old alliance between moonseers and werewolf kings goes back centuries, he confirmed. They've been waiting their entire lives to see that partnership renewed. A woman emerged from the crowd, elderly but strong, her silver hair braided with what Lyra's sight revealed to be protective charms. When she spoke, her voice carried absolute authority despite her small stature. "Elena's daughter," she said. Not quite a question. "I am Grandmother Senna, eldest of this pack. We felt the convergence 3 days ago. The mountains themselves sang of your awakening." Lyra inclined her head respectfully, instinctively understanding that this woman's approval would be crucial. "I'm honored to meet you, Grandmother. I'm sorry it took me so long to come home." A smile creased the elder's weathered face. "You came precisely when you were meant to, child. No sooner, no later. Your mother always said you would know when the time was right." The crowd parted as Kieran led Lyra toward the lodge, but she could feel their hope following her like a tangible force. These people had been waiting, protecting themselves and their territory while their alpha king fought his curse in exile. Now they saw the possibility of something they'd almost stopped believing in, not just their leader's return, but the restoration of the ancient alliance that had once kept their world in balance. Inside the lodge's great hall, maps covered every available surface. Lyra approached them with growing dread, her sight immediately revealing the scope of Volkov's expansion. Red markers indicated territories that had fallen under his control, yellow showed contested regions, and green marked the dwindling number of free supernatural communities. "It's worse than I thought," she said. "He's been building toward this for years," Kieran confirmed. "Consolidating power, eliminating rivals, converting or destroying anyone who might oppose him." Professor Thorne and Sarah entered with Vivienne, both looking overwhelmed by their first glimpse of werewolf society. But Lyra's attention was caught by something else, a new vision suddenly blazing across her consciousness with urgent clarity. She gasped, staggering as the prophetic sight hit her. Volkov wasn't just massing forces for a conventional war. He'd found something, some ancient weapon or forbidden magic that would shift the balance irrevocably in his favor. The vision showed her cities burning, supernatural communities enslaved or destroyed, and the careful secrecy that protected both worlds shattered forever. 3 days, she whispered, the timeline burning itself into her mind. We have 3 days before Volkov launches his final offensive. The assembled allies fell silent, the weight of that impossible deadline settling over them like a shroud. Lyra straightened, feeling the full burden of her inheritance settling onto her shoulders. Her quiet life was gone forever. Her childhood dreams of simple musical success had been swept away by forces beyond her control. But looking around at the faces of those who now depended on her, Sarah's fierce loyalty, Kieran's love and trust, the hope of an entire pack who'd waited years for this moment, she felt something unexpected blooming in her chest. Not resignation or fear, but determination burning bright as starfire. Then we'd better get to work, she said. The final confrontation was coming, whether she felt ready or not, but she would not face it as the broken, hiding girl she'd been just days ago. She would meet it as what she'd always been meant to become, the last Moonseer, with all the power and responsibility that title carried. The road back to her true self was complete. Now came the battle for everything she held dear. The words hung in the air like a battle cry, and Lyra felt the shift in the room's energy as her declaration galvanized everyone present. 3 days to prepare for a war that would determine the fate of both the supernatural and human worlds. 3 days to forge an alliance from scattered, desperate communities who had spent decades learning to mistrust each other. Grandmother Senna, Lyra said, turning to the pack elder. I need to know everything about the old alliances. Every supernatural community that once stood with the Moonseers and Werewolf Kings. Some of them must still remember. The elderly woman's eyes brightened with fierce approval. There are more than you might think, child. The vampire covens of the northern coast, the Fey enclaves in the Redwood territories, even some of the human mage families who traced their lineage back to the original treaties. She paused, her expression growing thoughtful. But they will need proof that you are truly Elena's daughter, and that the ancient bonds can be renewed. Lyra nodded, already feeling the weight of what that would require. What kind of proof? The ritual of convergence, Kieran said quietly, understanding flickering in his eyes. It hasn't been performed in over a century. The Moon Seer and Alpha King must join their powers completely, creating a beacon that every supernatural being within 1,000 miles will feel. Through their soul bond, Lyra felt his deeper concern. The ritual would require absolute trust and vulnerability from both of them, and for someone who had spent decades fighting to maintain control over his curse, the idea of deliberately lowering every defense was terrifying. "There's risk involved," Professor Thorne interjected, moving closer to study an ancient text that Grandmother Senna had produced from somewhere. "If either participant isn't ready, or if the bond between them isn't strong enough, the convergence could burn out both their abilities permanently. Or kill them," Vivian added bluntly. The council records speak of 3 attempts at unauthorized convergences. None of the participants survived. Sarah stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "What about Volkov? Won't this ritual basically paint a giant target on your location?" "He already knows where we are," Lyra said, her prophetic sight showing her the enemy forces already moving toward the mountains. "Hiding isn't an option anymore. Our only chance is to gather enough allies to face him directly." She moved to the central map table, her supernatural vision overlaying strategic possibilities across the marked territories. But Sarah's right about the danger. The convergence ritual will announce our location to everyone, allies and enemies alike. We need to be ready for both. Kieran joined her at the table, his tactical mind already working through defensive positions and escape routes. "The valley has natural advantages, but we can't hold it against Volkov's full force indefinitely. The ritual needs to happen quickly, and we need to be prepared to move immediately afterward." "What about the pack?" Sarah asked. "These people have lived here for generations. You're asking them to potentially lose their home." Grandmother Senna's voice cut through the discussion with quiet authority. "Child, home isn't a place. Home is the people you protect and who protect you in return. This pack has been waiting 40 years for our Alpha King to reclaim his full power. We'll follow him and our Moonseer wherever the path leads." Lyra felt tears sting her eyes. Not her damaged physical eyes, but the supernatural sight that showed her the profound loyalty and trust radiating from every pack member present. These people barely knew her, yet they were willing to risk everything on the strength of an ancient alliance and their faith in Kieran's judgment. "When?" Kieran asked simply. "Tonight," Lyra said, the certainty settling over her like armor. "Under the new moon, when the barriers between worlds are thinnest. It will amplify the ritual's power and ensure the call reaches every potential ally. That gives us roughly 12 hours to prepare defenses and send advance warnings to the communities we're hoping to rally," Kieran calculated. "Vivian, can the Council's communication networks reach the vampire covens by sunset?" "If I leave immediately," Vivian confirmed. "But Lyra, you need to understand. Some of these alliances have been broken for good reasons. The Fae in particular, they don't forgive easily, and there was bad blood between them and the last Moonseer generation. Then I'll have to convince them that I'm not my mother's mistakes," Lyra said firmly, "and that whatever grievances they hold against the past matter less than surviving the future Volkov has planned." She turned to face the assembled group, feeling the full weight of leadership settling onto her shoulders. "Everyone knows their tasks. Vivian, rally the old allies. Professor Thorne, help Grandmother Senna prepare the ritual space. Sarah," she paused, looking at her best friend's determined but frightened face, "I need you to document everything. If this goes wrong, if Kieran and I don't survive the convergence, someone needs to tell our story. Someone needs to warn whoever comes after us." The final test was beginning, and there would be no second chances. Sarah's camera clicked rapidly as she captured the frenetic preparations, but Lyra barely heard it. The hours until nightfall compressed like a closing fist, each minute bringing them closer to either salvation or catastrophe. The ritual circle had been carved into the ancient stone platform behind the lodge, symbols that predated written language glowing faintly under Grandmother Senna's careful ministrations. Lyra's supernatural sight revealed the geometric perfection of each mark. This wasn't just ceremony, but a complex magical mechanism designed to channel powers that could reshape reality itself. Movement on the eastern ridge, called Marcus, Kieran second in command, as he loped into the clearing in half-wolf form. Scout says it's not Volkov's main force yet, but advance units are definitely positioning themselves. Kieran didn't look up from the defensive positions he was marking on a hastily drawn map. How many? 30, maybe 40. Mixed pack. Some of his converted wolves, but also mercenaries. The kind that don't ask questions as long as the pay is good. Lyra felt the familiar chill of prophetic vision sliding down her spine. But this time, instead of distant possibilities, she saw immediate danger. Figures moving through the forest with military precision, weapons that gleamed with more than just steel, and at their head, a woman whose aura radiated cold ambition. "It's not a scouting party," she said, her voice cutting through the tactical discussion. "It's an assassination squad. They're planning to strike, during the ritual, when Kieran and I are most vulnerable." Clearing fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through pine needles. Everyone understood the implications. If the convergence ritual was interrupted at the wrong moment, the magical backlash wouldn't just kill Lyra and Kieran, it would devastate everyone within miles. "We could postpone," Professor Thorne suggested quietly. "Wait for better conditions." "There won't be better conditions," Lyra interrupted, her sight showing her the inexorable approach of Volkov's main forces. "Every hour we delay gives him more time to consolidate power and eliminate potential allies. It's tonight or never." Sarah lowered her camera, her face pale but resolute. "Then what do you need from us?" Lyra turned to study the ritual circle, her enhanced vision revealing the complex energy patterns that would soon channel power, beyond anything she'd previously imagined. The ancient moonseers had been right to fear this magic. It was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, capable of transcendence or destruction depending on the worthiness of those who wielded it. "A distraction," she said finally. "Something to draw the assassination squad away from the ritual site long enough for Kieran and me to complete the convergence. I'll lead a team to intercept them," Marcus offered immediately. Kieran shook his head. "You'll be outnumbered and outgunned. Those aren't ordinary weapons they're carrying." Lyra's sight suddenly blazed with terrible clarity, showing her a path through the approaching chaos. She saw the assassination squad's route, their planned timing, and most importantly, the single point where they were most vulnerable. "Not intercept," she said, her voice carrying new authority. "We're going to let them come." The assembled allies stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. Even Kieran's bond connection radiated concern and confusion. "The ritual circle isn't just designed to channel our power outward," Lyra continued, her understanding deepening as she saw the ancient mechanisms more clearly. "It's also a defensive structure. If we can draw them into the circle's influence while the convergence is already underway, the magical feedback will overwhelm them," Grandmother Senna finished, her weathered face lighting with fierce approval. "Clever child. Your mother would be proud." "It's also incredibly dangerous," Professor Thorne protested. "Any disruption to the ritual at that stage will require perfect timing and absolute trust," Lyra agreed. "Which is why everyone else needs to be clear of the area. This is between Kieran and me and whoever Volkov sent to stop us." Through their soul bond, she felt Kieran's mixture of admiration and terror at the audacious plan. They would be using themselves as bait, gambling everything on their ability to complete the most dangerous magical, ritual, and supernatural history, while under direct attack. "The sun's setting," Sarah said quietly, pointing toward the western peaks where golden light was fading to amber. Lyra nodded, feeling the weight of destiny settling around her like a mantle. In a few hours, she would either emerge as the fully awakened moonseer capable of rallying the supernatural world against tyranny, or she would die in the attempt. But as she looked around at the faces of those who had chosen to stand with her, Sarah's unwavering friendship, Kieran's love burning bright as starfire, the pack's faith in ancient alliances, even Vivian's grudging respect, she realized something that surprised her. She wasn't afraid. The broken girl who had stumbled into the wrong seat was gone forever. In her place stood someone ready to claim her birthright, no matter the cost. "Let's end this," she said. The ritual circle glowed with ethereal light as full darkness settled over the mountains. Lyra knelt at the northern point of the ancient symbol, feeling the stone's cold bite through her clothes. Across from her, Kieran's eyes reflected the supernatural radiance, wolf and man in perfect balance as he prepared to surrender the control he'd fought decades to maintain. "Remember," Grandmother Senna whispered from the circle's edge, her voice barely audible above the rising wind. "Complete trust, complete surrender. The moment either of you holds back, the convergence will fail." Through their soul bond, Lyra felt Kieran's terror, not of death, but of losing himself entirely to the curse that had defined his exile. For someone who had built his entire existence around careful restraint, the ritual's demand for absolute vulnerability was a torture beyond physical pain. "I'm here," she murmured, extending her hands toward him across the carved symbols. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Their fingers touched, and immediately power began building between them. Lyra's supernatural sight exploded with blinding intensity as their abilities began to merge and amplify each other. She could see everything: the pack members retreating to safe distances, Sarah clutching her camera with white knuckles, and most clearly, the assassination squad moving through the forest with deadly purpose. The leader was a woman Lyra recognized from her visions, Katerina Reeves, one of Volkov's most trusted enforcers. Her aura radiated cold precision and absolute loyalty to her master's cause. Behind her came 30 elite soldiers, each carrying weapons inscribed with runes designed to disrupt supernatural abilities. "They're close," Lyra whispered, the convergence power making her voice echo strangely in the still air. Kieran nodded, his own transformation beginning as the ritual stripped away every barrier he'd built around his curse. But instead of the violent, uncontrolled change that had plagued him for years, this shift felt like coming home. His wolf nature emerged not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a partner in perfect harmony. The power building between them grew exponentially, creating a beacon that blazed across multiple planes of existence. Lyra felt it reaching out like ripples in a vast supernatural ocean, touching minds and hearts across hundreds of miles. Vampire covens in their hidden mansions, fey courts in their secret glades, mage families huddled in warded sanctuaries. All of them would feel this call and know that the ancient alliances could be reborn. But the very force that would rally their allies also painted an unmistakable target for their enemies. Katerina burst from the tree line with military precision, her squad spreading out to surround the ritual circle. "Elena's little girl," she called, her voice carrying cruel amusement, "playing with forces beyond your comprehension. Volkov sends his regards." The soldiers raised their weapons, not guns, but crystalline devices that hummed with anti-magical energy. Lyra's sight showed her the devastating potential of those weapons. A single shot would disrupt the convergence so violently that the backlash would shatter both her and Kieran's minds. "Complete the ritual," Kieran growled, his voice now carrying harmonic undertones as wolf and human nature merged completely. "Trust me." Lyra nodded, pouring every ounce of her power into the convergence. The ancient symbols carved around them blazed with light bright enough to turn night into day. She felt her consciousness expanding, touching realms of possibility that no human mind was meant to comprehend. And in that moment of transcendent vulnerability, she understood what the sacrifice would be. To complete the convergence, to become the fully awakened moonseer capable of leading the supernatural world against tyranny, she would have to give up the one thing she'd fought hardest to reclaim: her sight. The power burning through her was too vast for any human vessel. Something had to be surrendered to contain it. Her physical vision, already damaged, would be the price of true sight. "Fire!" Katerina commanded. The anti-magical weapons discharged simultaneously, their disruptive energy lancing toward the ritual circle. But Lyra was ready. Instead of trying to defend against the attack, she and Kieran channeled it, using the convergence power to transform destructive force into something else entirely. The weapon's energy struck the ritual circle and rebounded, amplified by the very magic it was designed to destroy. The feedback wave swept outward in all directions, and every member of the assassination squad collapsed instantly, their life forces overwhelmed by power beyond mortal comprehension. Katerina managed a single scream before the light consumed her. When the radiance finally faded, Lyra opened her eyes to familiar darkness. Her physical sight was gone completely now, burned away by the forces she'd channeled, but her supernatural vision blazed brighter than ever, showing her a world transformed. Kieran knelt before her, his curse finally broken, able to shift between forms with perfect control. Around them, the Convergence's call was already being answered. She could see supernatural beings across the continent beginning to move, drawn by the ancient summons. The price had been paid. The war could begin. But as Kieran's arms enclosed her in the ritual circle's fading glow, Lyra realized that some sacrifices led not to loss, but to finding something infinitely more precious than what was given up. The silence that followed was profound, not empty, but full of potential. Like the moment between lightning and thunder, Lyra remained still within Kieran's embrace, her consciousness slowly settling back into the boundaries of her transformed body. The convergence power still hummed beneath her skin, but controlled now, integrated rather than overwhelming. "Is it done?" Sarah's voice came from somewhere beyond the ritual circle, cautious and wonderstruck. Lyra lifted her head from Kieran's shoulder, her new sight revealing a world painted in colors that had no names. Where once she had struggled to see fragments of the supernatural realm, now reality itself was layered with meaning. The ash and char marks where Katarina's squad had fallen glowed with residual energy signatures. The ancient stones of the circle pulsed with satisfied completion, and everywhere, threading through the fabric of existence itself, she could perceive the responses to their call. "Yes," she said simply, though the word carried harmonics that made the remaining pack members step back in reverent awe. This was no longer the hesitant girl who had stumbled into the wrong seat. The Moonseer had awakened, and her voice now carried the authority of prophecy itself. Kieran rose smoothly, his movements carrying a fluid grace that spoke of perfect unity between his human and wolf natures. The curse that had tormented him for decades was gone, burned away in the same transformative fire that had claimed Lyra's physical sight. When he looked at her, his eyes held depths of gratitude and love that made her breath catch. "How do you feel?" he asked, though their soul bond already shared the answer. "Complete," Lyra said, surprising herself with the truth of it. The blindness she had fought so hard to overcome was gone, but so was the desperate need to see with human eyes. Her new sight was vast beyond anything she could have imagined, showing her not just what was, but what could be, what should be, and what must never come to pass. Grandmother Senna approached the circle's edge, her weathered face bright with tears. "Child, you burn like starlight." The old legend spoke truly. A fully awakened Moonseer can see all the way to the heart of creation itself. Through her enhanced perception, Lyra felt the ripple effects of their ritual spreading across the continent like wildfire. In a mansion outside Seattle, 3 vampire elders lifted their heads in sudden recognition. Deep in the Olympic Peninsula, a Fae Queen paused in her eternal dance, ancient memories stirring. From hidden sanctuaries and forgotten strongholds, the supernatural world was beginning to answer. But she also saw darker responses. In his fortress of stolen power, Viktor Volkov felt the convergence like a physical blow, his carefully laid plans suddenly thrown into chaos. The fear and rage radiating from his location made Lyra's new abilities sing with warning. He would not take this challenge lightly. "They're coming," she said, turning toward the east where her sight revealed approaching forces that dwarfed the assassination squad. "Volkov isn't waiting. He's mobilizing everything." Kieran's hand found hers, their connection now so seamless that she wasn't sure where her awareness ended and his began. "How long do we have?" 3 days, Lyra said, the certainty flowing through her like ice water. "Maybe 4 if the weather holds." She paused, her sight shifting to encompass the broader patterns of conflict spreading across the supernatural world. But that's not what matters. The real battle won't be won through strength alone. Sarah finally approached the circle, her camera hanging forgotten around her neck. "Lyra, your eyes," she whispered. Lyra smiled, knowing what her friend saw, not the familiar brown of her original sight, nor the clouded white of her damaged vision, but something entirely new. Eyes that held depths of silver starlight, beautiful and terrible in their alien perfection. "I can't see you the way I used to," Lyra admitted, reaching out to touch Sarah's face with gentle fingers. "But I can see who you truly are, all the way down to your soul. And Sarah, you shine like everything brave and loyal in this world." Professor Thorne materialized from the shadows, where he had waited out the ritual, his scholarly composure cracked by wonder. The convergence worked beyond all historical precedent. "I'm reading energy signatures that suggest the awakening was more complete than any previous moonseer achieved. Because I didn't do it alone," Lyra said, her free hand tightening on Kieran's. The ancient texts assumed the moonseer would stand apart, above other supernatural beings. But isolation was never the source of true power. She turned to face the assembled pack members, her voice carrying to every corner of the clearing. "The old ways are ending. What we're building won't be a return to the past, but something entirely new. Alliances based on choice rather than tradition. Unity founded on mutual respect rather than ancient hierarchies." As if summoned by her words, a howl echoed across the mountains, not from Volkov's approaching forces, but from the west, where the first of their new allies had begun to arrive. The war was coming, but they would not face it as they once had, scattered, suspicious, and alone. They would face it together. The howl was answered by another, then another, until the mountain peaks rang with voices of welcome. Lyra's transformed sight revealed the approaching figures. Werewolves from the coastal territories moving through the forest with purposeful grace. But behind them came others, pale forms that glided rather than walked, beings that flickered between human and something altogether more ethereal. "The Vancouver Coven," Kieran murmured, wonder threading through their bond. "I haven't seen them in 50 years. Through her enhanced perception, Lyra watched the supernatural procession emerging from the tree line. The werewolves came first, their alpha, a silver-haired woman with scars marking her face, approaching with cautious respect. Behind her, 3 vampires moved like liquid shadow, their ancient eyes fixed on Lyra with expressions of reverence and wariness in equal measure. But it was the final figure that made everyone in the clearing fall silent. She appeared human at first glance, but Lyra's new sight revealed wings of pure light folded against her back, invisible to normal vision. A fey noble, stepping into the mortal realm for the first time in centuries. "Moonseer," the scarred alpha said, dropping to one knee beside the ritual circle. The old song spoke truly. "We felt your call across 3 territories." The vampire elder, a man whose aura spoke of millennia lived in shadow, inclined his head with formal precision. "The ancient debts are remembered. House Nightfall offers its allegiance." The fey noble said nothing, but touched her heart with graceful fingers, a gesture that carried more weight than any oath. Through her connection to the convergence power, Lyra felt the significance of that simple movement. The fey courts had bound themselves to neutrality for 1,000 years, but the fully awakened Moonseer commanded loyalties that transcended even their oldest laws. "Rise," Lyra said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the gathered supernaturals shiver with recognition. "We stand as equals in what's coming." Sarah pressed closer to her side, and Lyra was grateful for her friend S.'s steady presence amid the supernatural politics swirling around them. Through her enhanced sight, she watched Sarah's aura, still purely human, but blazing with courage and fierce loyalty that put many immortal beings to shame. "I need to document this," Sarah whispered, raising her camera with shaking hands. "The world needs to know what you've accomplished." Professor Thorne cleared his throat, his scholarly excitement barely contained. "The convergence appears to have activated dormant ley lines throughout the Pacific Northwest. I'm detecting energy fluctuations as far south as the Bay Area and as far north as Alaska," Lyra finished, her sight revealing the vast network of power now responding to her call. The awakening touched every supernatural sanctuary on the continent. They'll all have felt it, including those who served darker masters. Even now, her enhanced perception showed her Volkov's agents moving through cities and wilderness areas, spreading word of the Moonseer's return. The tyrant was mobilizing not just supernatural forces, but human allies who believed his promises of order through dominion. "The war begins now," Kieran said, his voice carrying the authority of an alpha king. who had finally claimed his full power, but were not the scattered, frightened refugees Volkov expects to face. Lyra nodded, feeling the weight of prophecy settling around her like a familiar cloak. Her sight revealed possible futures branching endlessly ahead, paths of victory and defeat, triumph and terrible loss. But through them all, one truth blazed constant: the supernatural world would never again be the same. "There's something else," she said, turning toward the assembled allies. "The convergence showed me why Volkov truly fears the Moonseer's return. It's not just our ability to unite the supernatural world against him." She paused, watching their faces as understanding dawned. "It's what comes after. The old barriers between our worlds are weakening. Human and supernatural, mortal and immortal, the boundaries our ancestors died to maintain are becoming permeable." Through their bond, she felt Kieran's sudden comprehension. The ritual hadn't just awakened her abilities, it had begun a transformation that would reshape reality itself. A new age. The Fae Noble spoke for the first time, her voice like silver bells in mountain wind. The prophecies spoke truly. The Moonseer's awakening heralds the convergence of all realms. Sarah's camera clicked as she captured the moment, though Lyra knew no photograph could contain the supernatural radiance now filling the clearing. Her best friend was documenting history itself, the birth of a world where magic and mundane would no longer exist in careful separation. "Then we'd better make sure it's a world worth living in," Lyra said, her transformed voice carrying absolute conviction. As if in answer to her words, more howls echoed across the mountains. The supernatural world was coming home at last. But in the distance, darkness gathered as ancient enemies prepared for one final, apocalyptic war. The Moonseer had returned, and nothing would ever be the same. The new beginning. 1 year later, Lyra stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Moonhaven Academy's renovated East Wing, her enhanced sight taking in the extraordinary scene below. Where once the academy grounds had hosted only human students and faculty, now they bustled with activity that would have been impossible to imagine before the convergence. A group of teenage werewolves practiced shifting techniques under the patient guidance of Professor Thorne, who had discovered a remarkable aptitude for supernatural education. Nearby, vampire scholars worked alongside human researchers in the Academy's expanded library, their combined lifespans offering perspectives that revolutionized everything from historical research to medical breakthroughs. In the gardens, Fae children played with their human counterparts, their laughter carrying harmonics that made the flowers bloom out of season. Remembering when this all seemed impossible? Sarah's voice came from the doorway, warm with affection and amazement that still colored their daily conversations. Lyra smiled without turning, her sight revealing her best friend's approach through the reflection in the window. Sarah carried 2 steaming mugs and the satisfied weariness that came from another successful day documenting their transformed world. Her book about the convergence had become an international phenomenon, bridging human and supernatural communities with unprecedented honesty. "Some days I wake up wondering if it was all an elaborate dream," Lyra admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Then I see something like this, and I remember that dreams can become reality when enough people refuse to accept the limitations they've been given." Through their soul bond, she felt Kieran's presence before he appeared at her other side, his arrival as natural as breathing. The Alpha King had adapted to their new world with characteristic determination, becoming a bridge between the old supernatural hierarchies and the emerging integrated society. His curse was a distant memory now, replaced by a harmony between human and wolf that made him more effective than ever. "The Portland delegation just confirmed," he reported, sliding his arm around her waist. 3 more cities are formally adopting the Moonhaven Accords, humans and supernaturals sharing civic responsibility, legal protections, and social spaces. It hadn't been easy. The war with Volkov had raged for 6 brutal months before the tyrant's final defeat in a confrontation that still haunted Lyra's dreams. Even after his death, pockets of resistance had fought against integration with desperate fury. Some humans couldn't accept that the supernatural world existed. Some supernatural beings couldn't abandon centuries of secrecy and superiority. But gradually, inevitably, the new world had taken root. "Any word from the European councils?" Sarah asked, her journalist's instincts always reaching for the broader picture. Mixed, Kieran replied diplomatically. The Scandinavian territories are moving toward integration, but the Mediterranean covens are still holding to traditional isolation. Change takes time. Lyra's sight shifted to encompass the wider patterns of transformation spreading across the globe. The convergence had indeed weakened the barriers between realms, but in ways that fostered growth rather than chaos. Children born after the awakening showed remarkable adaptability, some humans developing minor supernatural sensitivities, some supernatural offspring displaying unprecedented control over their abilities. The children understand it instinctively, she mused, watching a human girl of perhaps 8 years old successfully mediate a disagreement between two young werewolves. For them, this isn't a new world, it's just the world. Grandmother Senna's voice reached them from the hallway, calling students to the afternoon assembly. The elder had become Moonhaven's first dean of integrated studies, her wisdom proving essential in developing curricula that honored both human knowledge and supernatural tradition. "We should go," Lyra said, but she lingered a moment longer at the window, her transformed sight taking in the fullness of what they had built together. Below, she could see the energy patterns that connected every living being on the grounds, threads of friendship, respect, curiosity, and hope that wove together into something larger than any individual community. This was what the ancient prophecies had truly foretold, not the return of supernatural dominance, but the birth of genuine unity. As they walked toward the assembly hall, Lyra felt the familiar tingle of prophetic insight touching her consciousness. Her sight showed her glimpses of possible futures, challenges yet to come certainly, but also wonders beyond imagination. Cities where magic and technology evolved together. Universities where human and supernatural scholarship pushed the boundaries of reality itself. A world where difference was celebrated rather than feared. "Do you ever miss it?" Sarah asked quietly. "The simplicity of before?" Lyra considered the question as they entered the hall filled with faces both familiar and impossible. Students and faculty representing every corner of two worlds that had learned to become one. "I missed the girl I was," she said finally, taking her place at the podium where she would address the assembly. "But I wouldn't trade who I've become, or what we've built together, for any version of simple." As she looked out at the gathering, her enhanced sight revealed the truth that sustained her through every challenge. They had not lost their humanity in embracing the supernatural, nor had they diminished magic by sharing it with mortals. They had discovered that the real magic was connection itself, the courage to reach across every barrier that separated heart from heart. The moon seer smiled and began to speak of tomorrow.